I still remember the way the room felt that night. The dim glow of the monitor, the hum of the air vent, the soft ticking of the wall clock that always sounded louder after midnight. I was sitting alone in the radiology reading room, finishing the last batch of routine studies. Most nights that late, nothing surprised me anymore. The scans blurred together into a predictable rhythm of fractures, sinus infections, kidney stones, and the occasional emergency bleed. But that night, everything about my routine was about to be shattered. And it started with a name I had never seen before: Daniel Reed. I clicked the file open without thinking, expecting nothing unusual. Daniel was 38, listed as a construction supervisor, referred for neurological symptoms described as vague but persistent. Nothing about the request hinted at urgency. No red flag, no alarm, just another case. I leaned back, stretching my neck, waiting for the images to load. I'd done this thousands of times. But the moment the first axial slice appeared on the screen, something in my chest tightened. Not a full gasp, just a pause, sharp, involuntary, like my body recognized something before my mind caught up. At first, I thought it was a glitch. CT images occasionally produce digital artifacts, streaks, distortions, misregistrations that disappear with a reload. So, I reloaded. Then again. But the distortion didn't move. It didn't flicker, didn't bend, didn't vanish. It was fixed, anchored inside the scan, embedded in the anatomy as surely as bone. I leaned closer, narrowing my eyes at the temporal lobe region. Something was off, subtly wrong. Not a tumor, not swelling, not bleeding. It was almost geometric, like a fold or shift in tissue alignment that made no anatomical sense. I felt that first cold ripple of unease, the kind that doesn't come from fear but from recognition, when your brain quietly tells you that something isn't following the rules. I've trained my entire career to recognize patterns. Radiology is built on that. Anatomy, symmetry, expected relationships between structures. But Daniel's scan ignored all of it. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an artifact from motion. Maybe a bad reconstruction. Maybe something wrong with the calibration. I checked everything. Metadata, parameters, slice thickness, rotation center, all normal. No errors. The images were real. The room suddenly felt impossibly quiet. Even the monitor hum seemed to fade, leaving only my heartbeat tapping steadily in my ears. I moved through the next slices, cautiously, as though something might change if I looked too quickly. But the distortion remained, consistent, unnatural, and deeply unsettling. It felt like staring at a language I should have understood but couldn't translate. I'd seen thousands of brains. I had diagnosed tumors, hemorrhages, congenital anomalies, infections. But this belonged nowhere. For a moment I sat completely still, my hand hovering above the mouse. I didn't want to keep going. I didn't want to scroll further and confirm that whatever I was seeing wasn't a mistake. But I did. Slice by slice, the unease grew. Something terrible was unfolding, and I was seeing its earliest footprint. I couldn't have explained it why at the time. I just knew. And that instinctive chill stayed with me long after I closed the scan. Years have passed since that night, yet I still hesitate before talking about it. I've handled difficult cases, tragic cases, heartbreaking cases. But none of them lingered the way Daniel's did. None ever challenged my understanding of the human body like this one. Even now, when I think back to that first flicker of wrongness on the screen, I feel the same quiet dread rising. Because that moment was only the beginning. Before that scan ever appeared on my screen, Daniel Reed was just a name, a patient referred for symptoms that didn't fit neatly into any category. But when we traced the story back,
head, as though a part of him kept slipping out of alignment. He talked about sudden waves of vertigo, moments of déjà vu that lasted far too long, and strange bouts of blankness he couldn't account for. By the time his primary care doctor referred him for imaging, everyone closest to Daniel sensed that they were approaching a breaking point. Whatever was happening wasn't fading. It was accelerating, gathering weight. And though none of us knew it at the time, that referral would become the final turning point before his world shifted irrevocably. When I reopened Daniel's file the following morning, I expected to see something that would make more sense in the light of day. Fatigue can warp perception, and I told myself I'd simply been overworked. But the moment the first slice appeared, that familiar cold hesitation returned. The distortion wasn't a flaw in the system. It wasn't fatigue. It was real, embedded deep within Daniel's temporal lobe, waiting to be understood. A normal temporal lobe has a predictable curvature, a smooth, symmetrical pattern that I could sketch from memory. But Daniel's looked subtly displaced, as though a portion of the tissue had folded inward on itself, without the compression or mass effect that would normally accompany such deformation. It wasn't the chaotic disorganization of a tumor, nor the uniform expansion of swelling, nor the acute sharpness of a hemorrhage. It was... deliberate isn't the right word, but structured, patterned. Wrong in a way that felt almost intentional, though I knew how impossible that was. I zoomed in, then out. I toggled window settings. I pulled up earlier sequences. Every adjustment only confirmed the same unsettling truth. The distortion held its shape no matter how I viewed it. The geometry refused to blend into normal structures, as though it existed in defiance of anatomy itself. I consulted a colleague, a senior radiologist, known for his sharp eye and calm interpretation. I didn't show him the notes or plant ideas. I simply loaded the scan and waited. Within moments, his brows pulled together. "What is that?" he murmured, leaning closer. "Is this motion artifact?" He checked the metadata, then the parameters, then the orientation. Everything was correct. The unease in his voice matched the growing tension in my chest. A neurologist joined us, scrolling slowly through the axial, coronal, then sagittal views. He pressed his lips together, thoughtfully at first, then with a sharper edge of concern. "It doesn't behave like tissue displacement," he said quietly, "but it's not vascular either. Are there earlier scans?" There weren't. This was our first glimpse of whatever was affecting Daniel. We spent hours reviewing the images, each of us searching for something, anything that would anchor this anomaly to a known diagnosis. But the deeper we looked, the more the rules seemed to shift beneath us. One radiologist suggested an exceedingly rare congenital malformation. Another proposed an atypical infiltrative process. But even those stretched the limits of plausibility. Nothing matched the symmetry, the subtle repetition, the almost geometric nature of the fold. That was the moment I felt the atmosphere in the reading room change. Curiosity had been replaced by concern. Quiet, professional, but unmistakable. When medicine encounters something unfamiliar, the first instinct is to search for patterns. But Daniel's images offered no foothold. Instead, they presented a puzzle that resisted classification at every turn. By early afternoon, we had exhausted every conventional explanation. And
like the architecture is folding inward instead of outward. He tapped the screen gently. That isn't something the brain does. Not spontaneously. Not naturally. His comment hung in the air longer than anything else that day. Because if the brain doesn't do this, then what does? We reviewed Daniel's symptoms in parallel with the findings. Episodes of déjà vu, dissociation, moments of lost awareness. All of them suggested temporal lobe involvement, but the imaging didn't line up with any seizure disorder or mass lesion. If anything, the scans looked as though reality inside that lobe had gently distorted, like a fabric twisted without tearing. That was what troubled me most. There was no sign of damage, just change. A transformation without trauma, guided by rules we couldn't decipher. By the end of the day, I found myself staring at the screen long after everyone had left, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with the world I thought I understood. It felt less like a medical finding and more like a message, one we didn't have the tools to interpret. And behind it all was the growing, unbearable question: if the brain could change in a way no known disease could explain, In the days following the scan, Daniel's condition shifted from concerning to urgent with an alarming speed none of us anticipated. When the neurologist contacted Erin to discuss the results and schedule additional testing, she confessed that something had changed at home, something she struggled to put into words. Daniel wasn't just confused anymore, he was afraid. He began waking up disoriented, sometimes standing in the hallway with his hands pressed against the wall as though grounding himself. Erin described mornings when he'd sit on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, breathing slowly, as though waiting for the world to settle. When she asked what was wrong, he always shook his head and whispered, "Just give me a second, just a second." But those seconds were stretching into minutes. His co-workers reported similar episodes, moments where Daniel froze, eyes glassy, jaw slack, unresponsive to questions until he blinked himself back into the present. They stopped letting him operate machinery. One man said he found Daniel standing in the break room, hand hovering over the coffee machine, motionless for nearly a full minute. A follow-up appointment was scheduled, but Daniel never made it. 3 nights before he was supposed to return for further testing, Erin called the neurologist in a panic. Daniel woke up at 3:17 a.m. gasping, drenched in sweat. Not from a nightmare. He insisted he hadn't been asleep. He said he came back too fast, a phrase Erin repeated with a tremor in her voice. She found him kneeling beside the bed, gripping the mattress so tightly his knuckles were white. He kept asking what day it was, what time it was, and how long he had been gone. Erin tried to reassure him, but Daniel wouldn't look at her. His breath shuddered out in broken waves like someone emerging from deep underwater. Then something happened that Erin struggled to describe clearly during our later conversations. She said Daniel seemed to see something slightly to the left of her, something she couldn't detect. His eyes fixed on a point near the doorway. He went silent, completely still. Erin said it felt like watching someone listen to a sound she wasn't able to hear. When she touched his shoulder to bring him back, Daniel startled so violently he slammed into the nightstand. He didn't apologize, not even react to the pain. He only whispered, "It's getting worse." This episode marked a breaking point. Erin convinced him to go to the ER the next morning. But Daniel refused to sleep for the rest of the night. He sat in the living room with every lamp turned on, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. Erin stayed with him, but she told us she felt helpless, like she was watching her husband slip into some internal place she couldn't reach. By morning, Daniel was exhausted but lucid enough to agree to the hospital visit. Before they left, Erin noticed something else. His speech had changed. Not slurred, not incoherent, just slower, as though he needed to think through each word before letting it out. In the ER, the deterioration was unmistakable. He answered questions with effort. He repeated himself. At times he paused mid-sentence, staring at the wall with that same distant awareness we'd all seen on the scans, but couldn't name. The team expedited everything: blood work, neuro-evals, seizure screening. While they worked, Erin sat beside him, holding his hand. But she later admitted
Dr. Harlan spent hours reviewing Daniel's imaging. He met with neurologists, neuroradiologists, and even a visiting research fellow who specialized in rare cortical malformations. Each expert approached the scans with that same initial confidence physicians have before confronting something that refuses to fit any category. They zoomed, rotated, adjusted contrasts, pulled up comparison studies, and eventually, one by one, their expressions dimmed into confusion. The distortion in Daniel's temporal lobe had not grown in the way a tumor grows, had not bled like a vascular injury, had not shifted like a herniation. It was simply altered, stable, yet fundamentally outside anatomical expectation, a structure that existed but shouldn't, a pattern with no name. The meetings became longer, the discussions quieter. At one point, a senior neurologist sat back in his chair rubbing his temples and admitted that in 30 years of practice, he had never seen brain tissue behave like this. That admission, spoken softly in the radiology conference room, left the entire team in a state that bordered on philosophical discomfort. Medicine is built on pattern recognition. These images offered none. They only deepened the uncertainty. Meanwhile, Erin visited every morning, clutching her husband's hand as though afraid that letting go would allow him to drift even further into whatever internal distance was pulling him away. She described to the staff the rare moments Daniel seemed aware, a few seconds where he would glance toward the window or murmur disjointed fragments about the shifting or things not lining up. They were echoes of the earliest symptoms, softened now into a kind of quiet confusion. Her voice would tremble each time she asked the same question, "Is this permanent?" And each time the doctors gave the only honest answer they had. They didn't know. Eventually, after stabilization and weeks of observation, the decision was made to transition Daniel to long-term neurological care. He was safe, medically speaking, his vitals stable, but his mind remained fractured, drifting. Erin described visiting him months later and finding moments when he seemed almost like himself again, only for his focus to dissolve moments later, as if his connection to the world were repeatedly slipping through invisible cracks. For Dr. Harlan, the case became a weight he could neither set down nor fully understand. Radiology is meant to reveal truth, to bring clarity to what the naked eye cannot see. Yet these images had done the opposite. He had uncovered something real, tangible, and still utterly inexplicable. At conferences, at home, even lying awake at night, he returned again and again to that original scan, tracing the impossible geometry that had started everything. The questions lingered, unanswered and unanswerable, shaping a silence that followed him long after Daniel's care was transferred. Some cases are difficult, some are tragic, but this one felt like staring into a part of the human brain that had never been mapped. A distortion without a diagnosis, a patient without a path forward, and a radiologist left with nothing but the unsettling knowledge that they had reached the limits of what medicine could explain. I still remember the feel of that room the night I stayed late to review Daniel's scans one last time. Radiology reading rooms have their own kind of silence, heavy, electrical, lined with the soft whir of processors and the distant beep of monitors down the hallway. But that night felt different. The hospital had thinned to only essential staff, and the glow from my monitors carved 3 pale rectangles across the desk, illuminating the edges of reports I hadn't touched. I wasn't there to work. I wasn't even sure why I'd come back. Something about Daniel's case had embedded itself deeper than any I'd seen before, and part of me needed to confront the images again, as if repetition might unlock some meaning I had missed. When I pulled up the original CT scan, the same cold weight settled in my stomach. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even dread. It was the recognition of something that challenged the basic assumptions I had built my career on. In radiology, everything has a pattern. Hemorrhage behaves like hemorrhage. Tumors follow predictable shapes and densities. Even rare congenital anomalies adhere to developmental logic. But Daniel's